You know a neighborhood has lost its way when a locked gate matters more than a human life. Ryan Bennett slammed his truck into park the instant he saw the flashing emergency lights reflecting across the quiet subdivision. The morning had started like any other Saturday in Maple Creek Estates, with sprinklers ticking across perfectly trimmed lawns and neighbors walking their dogs beneath rows of identical maple trees. But now every second carried a different kind of weight. An elderly resident had suffered a serious medical emergency only a few streets away, and the responding rescue crew had reached the community entrance only to find the main security gate sealed shut. Ryan had lived there long enough to know that the emergency override should have opened automatically. Instead, the ambulance sat motionless while the crew searched for another way inside. Standing directly in front of the control panel was Linda Foster, the president of the HOA, dressed as neatly as if she were heading to a board meeting instead of facing an emergency. She raised one hand toward the paramedics before anyone could move another inch. "No unauthorized vehicle enters without HOA approval," she declared with complete confidence. One of the responders explained calmly that they had already received the emergency dispatch and needed immediate access, but Linda folded her arms and insisted the electronic system had not verified their credentials. Ryan couldn't believe what he was hearing. He stepped forward and reminded her that every minute counted during a medical emergency. Linda barely glanced at him before pointing toward the posted community regulations mounted beside the gate. She spoke as though she were enforcing parking rules instead of delaying first responders. Ryan looked beyond the entrance and imagined a frightened family waiting for help that should have already arrived. He offered to manually unlock the side access gate, knowing exactly where the emergency release was located. But Linda immediately warned him that touching HOA property without authorization would result in fines and possible legal action. The rescue crew exchanged frustrated looks while attempting to contact dispatch again. The silence between radio transmissions felt longer than it really was. A few curious neighbors wandered toward the entrance after hearing the sirens. Some assumed there had been an accident. Others simply watched without understanding why the ambulance wasn't moving. Ryan turned to the growing crowd and asked if anyone else thought this made any sense. No one answered at first. The neighborhood had spent years learning that arguing with Linda usually meant receiving violation notices or endless complaints from the HOA. Even those who disagreed often stayed quiet. Then a teenager standing near the mailbox quietly pulled out his phone and began recording everything. Ryan noticed the camera but said nothing. He was focused on the gate, on the responders, and on the precious time slipping away. Another emergency vehicle arrived behind the first, adding more flashing lights to the peaceful street that suddenly no longer felt peaceful at all. Linda remained planted exactly where she stood, convinced that enforcing procedure was more important than adapting to the moment. Ryan realized this wasn't becoming a misunderstanding. It was becoming a decision, and every person standing there was about to witness exactly how far one person's obsession with control could push an entire community. Ryan refused to step away from the gate because every instinct told him that waiting quietly would only make the situation worse. One of the paramedics spoke into the radio again, requesting authorization to use an alternate entrance, but the dispatcher replied that the nearest secondary access point was almost half a mile away and partially blocked by ongoing landscaping work. Ryan knew exactly which entrance they meant, and he knew large emergency vehicles would lose valuable time trying to squeeze through that narrow route. He turned back toward Linda Foster and asked one more time for her to unlock the gate manually. She answered with the same calm voice she used during monthly homeowners association meetings, insisting that procedures existed for a reason and that exceptions created liability for the entire community. The words sounded completely disconnected from the urgency unfolding only a few yards away. More residents gathered near the entrance after hearing the repeated sirens. Some whispered that the ambulance should already be inside. Others assumed the electronic gate had malfunctioned. Linda immediately corrected them, announcing that the system was functioning exactly as intended and that she was simply following established community policies. Ryan noticed uncertainty spreading across the faces in the crowd. Many of these neighbors had spent years trusting Linda because she always presented herself as organized, responsible, and committed to protecting property values. Now they were watching those same priorities collide with a real emergency, and the confidence they once had in her leadership was beginning to crack. A woman named Emily Harris quietly approached Ryan and asked whether there was truly no faster way inside. Ryan pointed toward the emergency release cabinet mounted beside the gate, explaining that it could open the entrance within seconds if Linda allowed access. Emily looked directly at Linda, expecting a reasonable response, but Linda simply shook her head and warned everyone that interfering with association property could result in penalties under the community bylaws. Another resident frowned and asked whether those rules really applied during an emergency. Linda answered without hesitation that rules only mattered when they were enforced consistently. The statement left an uncomfortable silence hanging over the entrance. The teenage boy who had started recording earlier continued filming every exchange, carefully capturing both the stalled rescue vehicles and Linda's repeated refusals. Ryan noticed several other neighbors beginning to record as well, not because they wanted conflict, but because they sensed they were witnessing something that would be difficult to believe later. The paramedics remained professional despite their growing frustration. They continued communicating with dispatch while preparing to move equipment by hand if necessary. Ryan immediately offered to help carry whatever they needed through the pedestrian entrance. The lead paramedic appreciated the offer, but explained that several critical pieces of equipment were designed to remain with the primary response vehicle. Carrying everything individually across the neighborhood would slow them down even further. Just then, another resident hurried toward the gate, breathing heavily after running from deeper inside the subdivision. He explained that the family waiting for medical assistance had called again asking where the responders were because they could still hear sirens but had not seen anyone arrive. The words hit the entire crowd at once. Suddenly, the emergency no longer felt distant. It felt personal. Ryan looked around and realized the mood had changed completely. The neighbors who had remained silent only minutes earlier were now exchanging concerned looks. And for the first time, Linda stood surrounded not by supporters, but by people quietly questioning whether strict control had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Ryan could feel the atmosphere changing with every passing minute because the questions were no longer coming only from him. Emily Harris stepped closer to the locked entrance and asked Linda why the emergency override had not been activated if the situation was clearly legitimate. Linda answered with the same controlled expression, explaining that the override could only be used after verification through the homeowners association security process. One of the paramedics politely responded that emergency dispatch had already confirmed their identity before they arrived. Linda insisted that her community followed an additional layer of internal procedures. Even the responders seemed surprised that anyone would delay access after official emergency confirmation. Several neighbors exchanged confused glances. An older man named George Miller quietly admitted that he had lived in the neighborhood for almost 12 years and had never heard of an emergency approval process requiring the homeowners association president to personally authorize entry. That simple comment immediately drew attention from the crowd because George had served on previous neighborhood committees and rarely questioned community policies. Linda quickly replied that procedures had evolved over the years and that not every resident needed to understand administrative details. Ryan noticed that answer only created more uncertainty instead of ending the discussion. The teenage boy recording the scene slowly walked closer, making certain both the gate and every conversation remained visible in his video. Two more residents raised their phones as well. Nobody was shouting. Nobody was causing trouble. They simply wanted an accurate record of what they were watching unfold. Suddenly, another vehicle approached from inside the neighborhood. A worried woman stepped out before the car had fully stopped. Her eyes immediately searched the line of emergency vehicles outside the entrance. She introduced herself as the daughter of the resident waiting for medical assistance and explained that her family had been expecting help several minutes earlier. When she learned that the gate was still locked, disbelief spread across her face. She looked directly at Linda and asked the question that everyone else had been thinking. Was there truly a rule that mattered more than letting trained emergency professionals reach someone in need? Linda answered that maintaining secure access protected every homeowner in the community and that emotional decisions could not replace established policy. The woman's shoulders dropped as she struggled to understand the response. Ryan stepped beside her and quietly assured her that everyone outside the gate was doing everything they could to find another solution. At that exact moment, the lead paramedic received an updated message through the radio. The alternate entrance remained partially obstructed, but another rescue unit was attempting to approach from that direction. It would require additional travel time and specialized maneuvering to enter safely. Ryan calculated the distance in his mind and realized the delay would stretch even longer than anyone had expected. Emily turned toward the growing crowd and asked how many people believed the gate should be opened immediately. Almost every hand rose without hesitation. The shift happened so naturally that even Ryan paused for a second. Only minutes earlier, most of these neighbors had remained silent. Now they stood together, united not by anger but by common sense. Linda looked around and realized that the confidence she usually commanded during homeowners association meetings had quietly disappeared. For the first time since the confrontation began, she glanced toward the security control panel instead of the residents surrounding her. Ryan noticed the brief hesitation and understood something important. This was no longer simply about enforcing regulations. Somewhere beneath the carefully rehearsed explanations, Linda appeared to be protecting something she did not want the neighborhood to discover. Ryan kept watching Linda's eyes drift toward the security control panel because that brief moment of hesitation revealed more than anything she had actually said. Emily noticed it as well and quietly asked whether the emergency release recorded every activation. Before Ryan could answer, George Miller spoke from the back of the crowd and explained that years ago the system had logged every manual override along with the identification of whoever used it. Linda immediately interrupted him, insisting that the software had changed and that older procedures no longer applied. George frowned because he had helped approve the original installation and remembered exactly how the equipment worked. He did not argue. Instead, he pulled out his phone and searched through old neighborhood emails. Within moments, he found a digital copy of the installation summary that had been distributed to every board member years earlier. He handed the screen to Ryan, who quickly read a sentence stating that all emergency gate activity would be permanently stored for security and liability purposes. Ryan looked back at Linda and calmly asked whether those records still existed. Linda answered that she was not required to discuss internal administrative documents during an active situation. Her response only deepened the growing suspicion surrounding her decisions. At the same time, the teenage resident continued recording without missing a single exchange. Another neighbor, named Sarah Collins, stepped forward and quietly admitted that she had experienced a similar problem several months earlier when a utility crew had been delayed outside the community because someone insisted on following additional approval procedures. At the time, she assumed it had been a simple misunderstanding. Now she was beginning to wonder if the delay had never been accidental. Several residents nodded as they remembered other occasions when delivery drivers, contractors, and service vehicles had waited unusually long outside the entrance. Ryan realized people were beginning to connect events they had never questioned before. Then another unexpected voice joined the conversation. A landscaping supervisor arrived from the alternate entrance after hearing radio traffic from the emergency crews. He explained that his team had repeatedly requested permission to keep the secondary access road completely clear because emergency vehicles occasionally needed that route. According to him, the request had been denied several times after concerns were raised about the appearance of construction barriers and maintenance equipment. The supervisor did not accuse anyone directly, but he confirmed that written recommendations had been submitted to the homeowners association months earlier. Every head slowly turned toward Linda. She responded by saying that aesthetic standards and budget limitations required difficult decisions, adding that no one could predict every possible emergency. Ryan noticed that explanation landed very differently than she expected. Instead of reassuring the crowd, it sounded like an admission that appearance had taken priority over preparation. Emily quietly asked whether those maintenance requests were still available. The supervisor answered that his company archived every communication and could provide copies whenever necessary. Ryan could almost feel the balance beginning to shift. This was no longer one resident challenging an association president. Independent witnesses were appearing one after another, each bringing information that fit together like pieces of a puzzle. Just then, one of the paramedics received another update through dispatch. The alternate rescue unit had finally entered through the distant service road and was making slow progress toward the home because large equipment had to navigate around temporary obstacles. The relief that help was finally inside the neighborhood was tempered by the realization that the delay had been completely avoidable. As the crowd absorbed that news, Linda reached for her phone and quietly stepped away from the group, speaking in a low voice to someone no one else could hear. Ryan watched her closely because, for the first time since the confrontation began, she no longer seemed focused on defending the rules. She seemed far more concerned about who might arrive next and what they might discover. Ryan kept his attention on Linda as she ended the phone call and slipped the device back into her pocket with a confidence that looked increasingly forced. Before anyone could ask who she had called, a dark sedan entered through the pedestrian access lane and stopped beside the clubhouse. A man in a navy blazer stepped out carrying a leather portfolio. Several residents immediately recognized him as Daniel Brooks, one of the other Homeowners Association board members. His expression changed the moment he saw the emergency vehicles still waiting outside the main gate and the crowd gathered around the entrance. He walked directly toward Linda and quietly asked why the primary access remained locked during an active emergency response. Linda answered that she had followed established procedures because the responding vehicles had not completed internal verification. Daniel frowned and replied that emergency dispatch itself was the verification. Ryan noticed several neighbors exchange surprised looks because this was the first time another board member had openly questioned Linda's decisions. Daniel asked to see the access log from the gate control system. Linda hesitated before replying that the records could be reviewed later during a formal meeting. Daniel calmly explained that the association insurance policy required immediate documentation whenever emergency services experienced delayed access. That statement instantly captured everyone's attention. Emily asked whether that policy had always existed. Daniel nodded and explained that every board member received annual reminders because delayed emergency access created significant legal and financial concerns for the community. George quietly looked toward Ryan, as if another missing piece had finally fallen into place. Linda insisted that she had acted in good faith and that the situation was being exaggerated by emotional reactions. Daniel did not argue. Instead, he unlocked the control cabinet with a small key from his own ring and opened the metal panel beside the gate. Ryan expected him to press a button, but instead Daniel looked at the display screen inside the cabinet. His expression changed almost immediately. He asked Linda whether she had manually disabled the automatic emergency override earlier that morning. The question landed like a sudden gust of wind across the silent crowd. Linda answered that temporary adjustments were sometimes necessary during scheduled maintenance. The landscaping supervisor immediately spoke up, explaining that no maintenance had been scheduled for the gate that day and that his company had not requested any changes to the access system. Daniel continued reviewing the screen before quietly saying that the override had been switched into manual authorization mode nearly 2 hours before the emergency vehicles arrived. No one spoke for several long seconds. Ryan realized this discovery completely changed the direction of the entire situation. The delay was beginning to look less like an unfortunate misunderstanding and more like a deliberate choice. The teenage resident filming everything slowly moved closer, so the control panel remained visible in his recording. Sarah whispered that she had never even known the emergency override could be disabled. Daniel answered honestly that very few people had the authority to make that change, and that every adjustment was automatically recorded with a timestamp and user identification. Linda immediately objected, claiming the logs could easily be misunderstood without technical context. But her explanation no longer carried the certainty it once had. At that moment, another vehicle arrived at the entrance, this time displaying the markings of the local police department. 2 officers stepped out, spoke briefly with the lead paramedic, and then looked toward the growing crowd surrounding the locked gate. Ryan watched Daniel quietly close the control cabinet before turning to face the officers, and he understood that the conversation was about to move far beyond neighborhood rules and into questions that would require official answers. The 2 police officers approached without urgency, but with unmistakable focus, immediately separating the emergency response from the growing disagreement among the residents. The senior officer introduced himself and asked the lead paramedic for a brief timeline before speaking with anyone else. Ryan watched as the paramedic calmly explained when the crew had arrived, how long they had remained outside the locked entrance, and the repeated requests for immediate access. The officer listened carefully without interrupting and wrote detailed notes before turning toward Daniel Brooks, who quietly pointed to the gate control cabinet and explained what he had just discovered. Linda stepped forward before anyone else could continue and insisted that every decision she had made fell within her authority as Homeowners Association president. She explained that she believed she was protecting the community by verifying access procedures and denied any intention of delaying emergency services. The officer acknowledged her statement but clarified that his responsibility was to establish facts rather than intentions. He then asked whether the electronic access system preserved activity records. Daniel answered that every manual adjustment, override change, and gate operation was automatically logged with exact times and user identification. The officer requested that no one touch the control panel until the records had been documented. Ryan noticed Linda glance toward the cabinet once again before quietly folding her arms. The younger officer began speaking with residents individually. Emily described everything she had personally witnessed from the moment she arrived. George explained the original design of the emergency override system and why it existed. Sarah shared her previous experience involving delayed service vehicles, making it clear that she had not questioned it at the time, but now believed it might be relevant. The landscaping supervisor offered to provide copies of earlier maintenance recommendations requesting a permanently clear emergency access route. Each conversation added another piece to the same picture. Meanwhile, the teenage resident who had been recording since the beginning approached one of the officers and asked whether his video would be useful. The officer thanked him and explained that preserving an unedited recording could help establish an accurate timeline of events. Several other neighbors admitted they had also captured portions of the incident from different angles. Ryan realized that without anyone planning it, multiple independent recordings now existed, each documenting a different stage of the confrontation. Daniel then opened his portfolio and removed printed copies of recent association insurance guidelines that required unobstructed emergency access whenever first responders arrived. The senior officer carefully reviewed the documents before asking Linda whether the board had recently discussed changes to the gate procedures. Linda replied that operational adjustments sometimes occurred between formal meetings for efficiency and security reasons. Daniel quietly answered that no board vote had authorized disabling the automatic emergency override. That statement immediately shifted the attention back toward Linda. She responded that temporary administrative decisions did not always require advance approval. The officer simply wrote another note before asking for the exact date and reason the override had been placed into manual authorization mode. For the first time since the confrontation began, Linda did not answer immediately. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but everyone standing nearby noticed it. Ryan could almost feel the confidence draining from the crowd's former leader as simple factual questions replaced emotional arguments. Just then, the lead paramedic received confirmation through the radio that the patient had finally been reached through the alternate entrance and was receiving professional care. A wave of relief spread across the residence, but it did not erase the uncomfortable reality that valuable time had been lost. As that update settled over the gathering, the senior officer closed his notebook and calmly informed everyone that the next step would involve obtaining the electronic access logs and comparing them with dispatch records, security timestamps, and every available video recording, because only a complete timeline would reveal exactly how the delay had unfolded and who had made each critical decision. Ryan remained near the entrance as the officers continued assembling the timeline piece by piece, and what had looked like a neighborhood disagreement only an hour earlier was steadily becoming a documented sequence of verified facts. One officer received permission from Daniel Brooks to access the association computer inside the clubhouse, while another stayed outside collecting statements from residents who had witnessed different parts of the incident. Linda stood quietly nearby, no longer attempting to direct the conversation, but carefully listening as each new detail was added to the record. After several minutes, Daniel returned from the clubhouse carrying printed copies of the electronic access log. The officer spread the pages across the hood of his patrol vehicle and compared each timestamp with the emergency dispatch records already provided by the paramedics. Ryan watched the officer run his finger down the page until he stopped at one particular entry. The emergency override had been switched from automatic operation to manual authorization well before the first emergency vehicle reached the neighborhood entrance. Even more surprising, The system showed that no attempt had been made to restore automatic access after dispatch had notified the community of the incoming response. The officer asked Daniel whether those records could be altered after the fact. Daniel answered that the software automatically backed up every activity to an external server maintained by the security contractor specifically to prevent modifications. Before anyone could respond, another unexpected visitor arrived. A representative from the gate security company had been contacted by Daniel after the officers requested technical verification. The technician introduced himself, connected a service tablet to the control system, and confirmed that the printed records matched the permanent digital archive stored off-site. He also explained that every user account required a unique login credential, making it possible to identify exactly who made each system change. The officer asked one simple question: which account had disabled the automatic emergency override? The technician studied the display for a few moments before reading the answer directly from the screen. The change had been made using Linda Foster's administrator credentials. The surrounding residents became completely silent. Ryan noticed that nobody reacted with celebration because the confirmation carried a very different feeling. It transformed suspicion into documented evidence. Linda immediately replied that someone else could have used her credentials without permission. The technician respectfully explained that the login required both her password and a security authentication code generated on her personal device. Daniel quietly added that every board member had been instructed never to share those credentials because they controlled emergency infrastructure throughout the community. The officer simply recorded the explanation and moved to the next question. Why had the override been disabled in the first place? Linda answered that she had been reviewing security procedures earlier that morning and intended to restore the normal settings later. Daniel looked genuinely surprised because no board meeting, maintenance notice, or contractor request supported that explanation. At that moment, the teenage resident stepped forward with his phone and showed the officers the beginning of his recording. The video captured Linda telling the paramedics that she was intentionally refusing entry until her own approval process had been completed. The timestamp matched the electronic gate records almost exactly. Emily then shared her recording from another angle, clearly showing Ryan offering to use the emergency release while Linda warned him not to touch association property. George provided a third recording that documented the growing crowd and Linda repeating that the rules would not be changed regardless of the circumstances. One by one, every independent recording reinforced the same timeline without contradicting the others. Ryan realized the truth no longer depended on anyone's opinion because the evidence now supported itself from multiple directions. And as the officers gathered the final documents, Daniel quietly informed the residents that an emergency meeting of the Homeowners Association Board had already been called for that evening. Ryan had barely returned home when the notification for the Emergency Homeowners Association meeting appeared on every resident's phone. The meeting was scheduled for that same evening in the clubhouse, and for the first time since Ryan had moved into Maple Creek Estates, nearly every seat was filled before the board members even arrived. The atmosphere felt completely different from the quiet monthly meetings that usually focused on landscaping budgets and paint colors. This time nobody had come to discuss flower beds or fence heights. They had come to understand how a routine emergency had turned into a crisis at the neighborhood entrance. Daniel Brooks opened the meeting with a calm voice and explained that the purpose was not to assign blame through emotion, but to review verified facts collected throughout the day. He projected the electronic gate records onto a large screen where every resident could see the sequence of timestamps. The automatic emergency override had been disabled hours before the rescue vehicles arrived. The dispatch notification had been received. The gate remained locked. Manual authorization had never been granted. Daniel then displayed the confirmation provided by the security company showing that the system logs had been independently verified and securely archived. Nobody interrupted because the documents spoke more clearly than opinions ever could. Linda Foster requested an opportunity to explain her decisions. She stood and told the audience that she had always believed strict security protected the neighborhood and that she never expected an emergency to unfold the way it had. She insisted that every action had been taken with the intention of keeping unauthorized vehicles out of the community. Several residents listened respectfully, but the tone in the room had changed. They were no longer deciding whether they liked Linda or disliked her. They were comparing her explanation against the documented timeline already displayed in front of them. Emily Harris quietly stood and described what she had personally witnessed outside the gate. George Miller followed by explaining the original purpose of the emergency override system and why previous boards had insisted that no single administrator should ever allow routine procedures to interfere with emergency access. Sarah Collins reminded everyone about the earlier delays involving utility crews and admitted that she had dismissed those incidents until she recognized the same pattern during the emergency. The landscaping supervisor joined the meeting through a video call and confirmed that repeated requests to improve emergency access routes had been submitted months earlier. Each statement aligned with the records already presented. Ryan remained seated through most of the discussion because he believed the evidence mattered more than another speech. Then Daniel invited him to describe the moment when he first realized something was seriously wrong. Ryan calmly explained that he had never intended to challenge the homeowners association. He had simply expected common sense to guide an urgent situation. He looked around the room and said that rules earned respect only when they served people instead of standing in their way. The statement settled over the audience in complete silence. One by one, residents who had rarely spoken during previous meetings began expressing support for reviewing every emergency policy in the community. Even homeowners who had often defended strict enforcement agreed that no regulation should ever delay trained first responders. Daniel then announced that the board had completed a formal vote before the meeting began. Pending the outcome of the official investigation, Linda's administrative authority had been suspended, her access to the security system had been revoked, and an independent review of every emergency procedure would begin immediately. Linda slowly gathered her papers without arguing. As she walked toward the exit, the room remained quiet, not because anyone celebrated her downfall, but because everyone understood that the real victory belonged to a neighborhood finally choosing responsibility over unquestioned authority. Over the following weeks, Maple Creek Estates slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, but it no longer felt like the same neighborhood Ryan Bennett had known before that Saturday morning. The board moved quickly to complete the independent review that Daniel Brooks had promised, and every recommendation centered on one simple principle that nobody questioned anymore. Emergency access would always come before administrative procedure. The main entrance received a new fail-safe system that automatically opened for verified first responders. The secondary route was permanently cleared and widened, and quarterly inspections became mandatory instead of optional. The security contractor also trained every board member on the emergency controls, making certain no single person could ever disable critical safety features without immediate notification to the entire board. Residents who had rarely attended association meetings suddenly became active participants because they understood that good communities depended on involvement instead of blind trust. Emily Harris volunteered to help organize emergency preparedness events for the neighborhood. George Miller agreed to serve as an advisor during the review of older community policies, using his experience to identify outdated procedures before they created new problems. Sarah Collins joined a resident committee focused on improving communication between homeowners and the board so concerns would be addressed openly instead of quietly dismissed. Even the teenage resident whose recordings had helped establish the timeline received personal thanks from several neighbors for preserving an accurate record without provoking unnecessary conflict. The family whose medical emergency had brought everyone together later shared through Daniel that their loved one was recovering well, and they expressed sincere appreciation for every first responder and every resident who had tried to help despite the obstacles they faced. Hearing that news lifted a weight from the entire community. Ryan never considered himself a hero because he believed most people would have spoken up under the same circumstances. Still, neighbors stopped him during evening walks to thank him for refusing to stay silent when something obviously felt wrong. He always gave the same answer. He simply hoped that the next person facing an emergency would never have to wait outside a locked gate while someone searched through regulations. Several months later, the annual Homeowners Association election produced the highest voter participation the community had ever recorded. New board members were chosen based on transparency, cooperation, and practical leadership instead of promises about stricter enforcement. Daniel accepted the role of board president only after insisting that major operational decisions would always involve multiple members and documented review. The clubhouse bulletin board that once displayed mostly violation notices now included emergency contact information, preparedness resources, and clear explanations of community safety procedures. Ryan smiled the first time he saw local firefighters conducting a scheduled walkthrough of the entrance without encountering a single delay. The new gate recognized the emergency vehicle immediately and opened within seconds, exactly as it had always been designed to do. Standing nearby, several longtime residents quietly watched the demonstration and nodded with visible relief. Nobody mentioned the arguments from months earlier because they no longer needed to. The lesson had already become part of the neighborhood itself. Ryan looked around at the familiar streets, the children riding bicycles, the neighbors talking across front yards, and the entrance standing ready to welcome help instead of stopping it. He realized that the strongest communities were never defined by perfectly written rules. They were defined by people willing to remember why those rules existed in the first place. And in Maple Creek Estates, that understanding finally became stronger than the authority that had once overshadowed it.